Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this month's CultureCon community webinar. We're going to give folks about another minute or two to get signed in, and then we will get started. So bear with us about 2 more minutes.
Culture ultimately comes down to every person contributing to what you want to be as a team. And we tell folks, we need you to live these things, and we need you to challenge us. We are all uniquely positioned, and we all have things that are unique about us that give us the opportunity to step into things and make a positive impact around us. That's what this conference is all about. Culture is successful when we all decide we want to be a part of it, and even go one step further and pour who we are into that culture. I can say if culture is what makes us us, I want to be actively involved, and I want to help actually set the direction for who we are as a team or organization. If we want the collective to be great, it requires every individual devoting themselves to be great.
All right, thanks everyone again for joining us for this month's CultureCon community webinar. We'll get started here. My name is Zach Blumenfeld, and I'm the founder of CultureCon. We're out of Madison, Wisconsin, and although we have a community of culture geeks all across the country and the world now, our main event each year takes place here in downtown Madison, Wisconsin. Our mission statement is to impact the workplace by connecting humans to inspire positive change around organizational culture. We do this through a variety of different ways. This is a picture from our first annual conference. We just finished our second annual conference this past summer, and our third one is scheduled next August of 2020. We also have the CultureCon community to help facilitate change and networking and connection throughout the year, with these webinars being a part of that. We've now had connections with over 1,500 culture geeks, 14 events in 3 cities and online, and we're seeing impacts in the forms of survey results, stories, testimonials, people that are finding differences and changing things in their own lives and the lives of others in their organization. We have a few upcoming events. Mini CultureCon is a condensed version of our annual event in Milwaukee a month from today. We'll be at Good City Brewing. There will be 4 mini 15-minute presentations, and it's a really good place to network and connect with other culture geeks. So early bird tickets are available for a few more days, a month from today on the evening of October 24th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Earlier in that day, on October 24th, we'll have a more in-depth workshop led by Dr. Darren Ike, who focuses on design thinking and lean innovation. This is geared towards executives and high potential leaders, and we'll be out during the afternoon for about 4 hours to really do a deep dive workshop, very hands-on and engaging. And then we'll have our 3rd annual CultureCon next August 6th and 7th, 2020, right here in Madison, Wisconsin. We'll have over 500 culture geeks, a great bunch of engaging speakers, workshops, and facilitators. And early bird tickets are available now on our website for that as well. This webinar is put on by the CultureCon community, which I touched on a little bit just a few minutes ago. We have monthly webinars, and we're also building out an online forum for people to kind of stay connected and strategize, share best practices, and connect throughout the year. So you'll probably get some more emails regarding that over the next few months, and more opportunities like these to learn and grow. So now I'll turn it over to Jonathan Yankovich, who's going to lead our webinar this month, and he's going to take us through kind of how to create a culture of action takers with Holacracy. So I will turn it over to Jonathan now. Thanks, Jonathan, for being here.
Thanks, Zach. Hey guys, I'm Jonathan, and I'll get started here in just a second. I have to say it's really a different experience to be doing a webinar not knowing who I'm talking to. It kind of reminds me of like when you're thinking about swimming in the ocean, you don't really know what's down there and it's kind of scary. That's that's the experience I'm having. So we'll get started here in just a moment. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so the title of the talk is Create a Culture of Action Takers with Holacracy. Excuse me. And I'll probably go for 20 or 30 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. There's no way I can cover everything about Holacracy in this, this limited time, so we're just going to try to give you enough to get a little taste of it, kind of get excited, and hopefully leave you with more questions than you came in with, so you can then continue your learning journey. So just a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Jonathan Yankovich. I was born in Madison on the near west side about 40 years ago. And I spent the last 8 years in the San Francisco Bay Area working for various startups, mostly doing software development, some product work, some UX work, generally just making things. And then for the last 4 years, I've been with a company called Holacracy One. And this is the company that designed the Holacracy business operating system. Some of you may know what this is. Many of you may not. We'll go into it in varying degrees of detail. So when I was hired at Holacracy One, I was hired primarily for a development role, which you can see here in the middle of this screen. One of the interesting things about Holacracy is that you're allowed to hold many roles. So over the course of my time there, I moved from development into outreach, people in partnership, partner retreats. And by the end of my tenure, I had, I don't know, what is this, about 20 roles? Now, granted, they're not all full-time roles, but one thing that I was able to do, and that I don't think I would have been able to do otherwise, was move from software development into more of a coaching role. And in other organizations, you really wouldn't be able to do such a thing. You know, once you're a developer, you're always a developer. But in Holacracy-powered organizations, you can make those kinds of transitions. So I was able to align my personal mission and values with the organizations and really grow there. So now that I'm working on my own, I do consulting work under the name Work Better Together. I also develop some software to support self-management. This product's called Teal Dog. And I also run a YouTube channel called Work Better Together, where I make videos about Holacracy and the future of work, future of business culture, and just generally how people can work better together. You can find these at these various names, workbettertogether.io, soon to be effective.institute, and Teal Dog is just teal.dog. And then if you want to find me on YouTube, you can search for Work Better Together. And just a quick note on Teal Dog, the goal there is to create frictionless self-management software. If any of you have tried to do self-management and used the tools out there, you might know that they're questionable in terms of their usability. So I want to make this whole thing as easy to understand, implement, and execute as possible. So my purpose is to reduce human suffering by helping people work better together. And some of the methods that I use in this are getting things done from David Allen, obviously Holacracy, which was conceived by Brian Robertson. I also apply neuro-linguistic programming. My favorite school is Carl Buchheit's school, NLP Marin in Marin County, California. Tim Kelly's purpose work is also really important to me, as is Decker Kunov's authentic relating, which is really much bigger than Decker now. And something else that I think we usually tend to lose touch with, especially younger people who already know about these things, is all of the apps and tools out there that help us do work in new ways, like Google Docs, Slack, Zoom, Asana. The fact that we have all of the World Wide Web at our fingertips. These are all things that are shaping the way we do work together. So, creating a culture of action takers with Holacracy. Just want to make a little disclaimer. Holacracy is complicated and nuanced. We're not going to be able to cover everything today. I'm just going to give you a few of the concepts that I found most useful for getting an idea of what's possible. My goal is not to give you a complete set of instructions. It's really to entice you, to show you that there's another way. And I'm going to bounce around. There's a lot here. So pick up what you can, and hopefully we'll have some fun and learn something along the way. I'm also happy to follow up with people later, too. I'll give my contact info at the end. I love this stuff and I'm committed to helping people, so please reach out if any of this resonates with you. So what is Holacracy and what is it not? So Holacracy is a new way of structuring a business. You can also think of it as a set of rules and practices. And it's also a new way of relating to power at work. We won't get into power too much, but that's really where the root of this work lies. Most of what we'll focus on is going to be a little more high level. I just want to call out the words rules and practices here. It really is a set of practices. Some people compare it to yoga or karate. It's a practice that you continue to deepen your skill with. And it's definitely a set of rules, which we'll get to in a bit. So many of you may have heard of Holacracy, and a lot of people don't have the right idea about it. I just want to cover a couple things that Holacracy is not. Holacracy is not management theory. It was not written down in a business school. It was developed in the field, figuring out how people can work better in new ways. And so it's not management theory, and it eschews a lot of management theory. It's also not just a new meeting format or a set of meeting formats. There are some very cool meeting formats in Holacracy. Some of those are so valuable, I think if you just started doing them, you would be way ahead of lots of others. But some people think Holacracy is just a new meeting format. It's not. It's also not democratic. There's minimal voting, and it's not really a meritocracy. There's still very much sort of conventional power in some senses. But if you have the idea that it's a kumbaya where everyone votes, that's not what it is. And it's also not flat. People talk about the future of work being around flat organizations where everyone has the same authority. That's not the case here. Authority is very specific and it's distributed. It's just not all put in one person. And so instead of having one boss, you end up having many bosses, and you get some authority for yourself as well. But Holacracy is not flat. So some of the promises that Holacracy makes is to give clarity of role and purpose. And we'll talk more about why this is important later. But one of the big things that's lacking in business today is clarity. And the way you get clarity in Holacracy is by identifying roles and aligning around purpose. You might think about the last time in your business, in your work, that you thought about, well, what's my purpose right now? Hopefully some of you actually have thought about this if you're doing culture work. But many people, they don't really think about purpose, and they don't really necessarily even know the details of the roles that they're in. Holacracy is also about tension processing. And the reason I put this here, tension processing is a big deal. And one of the things that Holacracy does is it shows you where your tensions are. Now, when we talk about tensions, we're really talking about just a difference between how the world is and how you think it could be. You can imagine a rubber band stretching. The stretching of rubber band, and then when the tension is released, the tension is resolved. Holacracy will show you where your tensions are. And lots of our organizations have lots of really gnarly tensions, but we don't have any way to process them. So they continue to exist and fester and cause dysfunction. With Holacracy, you're actually given the levers to identify those tensions and process them. And Holacracy also delivers constant, safe, organic change. It does this by allowing a governance process, which we'll get to later. But instead of having a big reorganization every 3 years, or having some big having some executive decide that things are going to be different, everyone in the organization is encouraged to make small changes all the time that are safe and organic and constant. So our goal here today is to create a culture of action takers. Before we do that, we should probably ask ourselves, what's it like now? Right now in our organizations, you have to seek permission when you're trying anything new. Doing anything different requires asking permission of an authority. And you don't really know what you're allowed to do. You don't know the limits of your authority. If you have an idea, you don't know if you're allowed to do it, and you don't know the limits of your authority, as I said. You also don't know what you should do in some cases. If you were to take an action, Do you have any way of knowing that if that action actually aligns with the organization's purpose or your team's purpose without going to ask someone? And you also really don't know what you can count on from others. If you're trying to get something done or do anything out of the ordinary, you may have to call in favors or get your boss to tell somebody to help you do something. So you really don't know what you can count on from others, which makes it really hard to be someone that's taking novel actions. And overall, we just don't know how to talk to each other about action taking. To talk meaningfully in any specialized domain requires specialized language, and most people just aren't trained on this. Granted, people with MBAs can talk about big business things, but day to day, just getting our work done, we don't really have a specific language that we can use to talk to each other. When you put something like Holacracy into place, or even parts of it, you start to get the ability to have these conversations in a much more meaningful and much more clear way. So I also wanted to touch on what culture change is like now. I have some problems with how the community approaches culture and culture change. Sometimes we think of culture as our work environment. We've got the foosball table and the kegerator, and it's a great culture. Sometimes we think of culture as our values. Our organization values agility, or our organization values mindfulness. These are useful and good things to orient around. But I question their efficacy in terms of actually supporting action. Currently, culture is implicit. That means a lot of it is just kind of how it is around here. People try to develop artifacts and write things down, but there's no real declaration that things are different than they are anywhere else. And so we end up sort of running into what I call culture theater, where people construct sort of a reality where we talk about culture and things being different, but when you get right back down to it, is power and authority really any different? And so to contrast that, one thing we can do is move from implicit expectations to explicit expectations. This is one of the big shifts in Holacracy. So if you're going to take anything away from this, one of the first things to take away is the shift from implicit to explicit. Implicitly, we have beliefs and values, and these are abstract. So they're very hard to measure, and it's hard to tell if somebody is aligning with them. And it's also easy to project that somebody is not, which can be used sort of as a weapon against people. That's a topic of a different talk, which I would love to talk about if anyone's interested in that some other time. On the explicit side, we have practices and rules. These are rituals and procedures, and these are concrete. Why is it important that they're concrete? Because when it's concrete, it's measurable. And when it's measurable, it can be improved. And one of the best things about it is that there are no beliefs required. When we have a set of rules for how we play together, it doesn't matter what you believe, I can still work with you. This is a really key thing. So whereas in the implicit value systems of many organizations, if I don't share your values around kindness or agility or mindfulness or compassion or whatever like really well-meaning thing it is, I might be outcast as a result. And so I don't get to be myself at work. And I know it sounds weird to talk about like business and rule of law. This is one of the things in Holacracy that is really fundamental. And I'm not proposing that every organization do this, but I just want you to consider that you might start to have some written down agreements or standards. One way to do this is to use working agreements, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is the primary working agreement in Holacracy. It's called the Holacracy Constitution. And this document describes everything, every rule of how to work together in a business. And the reason it's so long is because it actually redefines how power works. Now, again, I'm not proposing that you do that. All we want to do here is create a culture of action takers. So to do that, if you're not ready for Holacracy, which very few are, we can start to use working agreements. So let's dip our toes into the world of working agreements. Working agreements come from the Agile world, though there's not a lot of talk about them used as explicitly as I'm going to propose that we use them here. So a working agreement is an explicit behavioral agreement. Anyone can create a working agreement. Anyone can request that somebody agree to it, and anyone may agree. These can be really, really trivial, or they can be really, really serious. Anyone can change their agreement at any time. So I can agree today, and 2 weeks from now, I can realize, you know what? I can't really agree to this anymore. You cannot expect this of me. I'm going to remove my agreement. And these can be public, so anyone can see the agreement. They can also be private, between you and me. They can be one-to-many. So as a manager, I can request everyone on my team agree to some standard. They can also be one-to-one. I can just request to somebody I work with, it can be something as simple as, when we start our meetings, can you not tap your pencil on the table? And they can also be from a person to themselves. You can simply declare to everyone else, hey, I agree to behave according to this standard. And then people know what they can expect of you. So we're moving from implicit to explicit. It's also important to have a single source of truth for these. And one of the things that my software tool TealDog does is gives you a single place to store all of your working agreements. So let's just talk a little bit about some examples. On the trivial side, you might have an agreement. You might say, I agree to do my dishes in the kitchen before finishing lunch. Or something a little more serious, when completing contracts, I agree to send a copy to the accounting department. But one of my favorite working agreements recently, and this is something I use with new clients, I ask everyone in the organization to agree to do their best. And by putting these fundamental agreements in place, we can start to build a pyramid of expectations on each other, not to coerce people into certain behaviors or trick them or corner them, just to get clear about what we can expect. So we just talked about working agreements and how when you have them, you can start to know what you can count on from others. So that's one of the 5. When we talk about the switch from implicit to explicit with regard to clarity of role and purpose, in an implicit system, you basically do whatever you're told. Your manager tells you to do something, you do it. You're the secretary and executive, he asks you to get his dry cleaning, you do it. You cannot do it, you don't know what will happen. But when we move to an explicit system, we're then in an environment where we're doing what makes sense for our roles. And we'll talk about this in a second. We'll give an example of a role and what that means. But it's a very different thing when you're acting based on an explicit written down role. And a role is very much like a job description, except it's evolving constantly and it's more clear. So this is my role constellation from Holacracy 1. This is the same slide I showed earlier, but I want to zero in on this one section here, this live streamer role. So we can see that a role has a purpose and accountabilities. It says the purpose is engaging in popular live stream sessions. And the accountabilities, first couple I'll just read, running live stream sessions on request of outreach roles, maintaining an updated, easy to reference schedule of streaming sessions and their hosts for multiple session events, and aligning with the needs of relevant on-site event support or event logistics roles for in-person events. I just want to talk about this first one, running live stream sessions on request of outreach roles. What this means is that now outreach can count on me to run events for them. It's an explicit agreement between me and the outreach circle or the outreach team to provide this service to them. So what you start to develop when you have accountabilities that reference other roles is what are sometimes called relationships between roles. And as these relationships become more explicit and there become more of them, you start to really see the structure of the organization. This again is an example of the move from implicit to explicit. So now that we have roles, we can ask ourselves a very important question. does this make sense for my role's purpose or accountabilities? And this is something we ask ourselves in Holacracy all the time. This is something I think that is useful to take away from this talk. When you're taking an action, does this make sense for my roles, purpose, or accountabilities? Now, until you have these things written down, you don't really know, you can kind of guess. But once you start writing it down, it gets a lot more interesting. And not just because you can ask yourself, but you can ask another. Would it make sense for your roles, purpose, or accountabilities to take a certain action? So now suppose we have the example of the executive and the secretary. The executive says, hey, would it make sense for you for your roles, purpose, and accountabilities to pick up my dry cleaning for me? Well, the secretary might reference her roles and see the accountability around answering the phone and the accountability around scheduling. And she might turn to the executive and say, no, you have no right to expect that. Now that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. It can be kind of scary and confrontational, but what it really is just being truthful and honest about our roles, being explicit. There's a nice follow-up to this that Holacracy provides. Would you like the right to expect it? So Holacracy provides a system for adding and changing accountabilities. This is known as the governance process. We don't have time to get into governance process today. It's a really lovely meeting process, and I'd be happy to talk to others about it another time, I guess. But when you can say, no, you don't have the right to expect it, would you like the right to expect it? And then take that to a governance meeting, now you're actually working on the structure of the business. You're addressing tensions in the business objectively. And when you do this, so much drops away in terms of politics and implicit expectations of each other. It really just lets people get to work and really, it gets a lot of personal stuff out of the way. People who are used to operating in political systems don't operate as well in Holacracy because they really have to stand on the merits of their work then. So that's the governance process. And when you do this, you end up with governance records, lots of governance records. Every role has a set of accountabilities, purpose, some other things that we haven't talked about. And so it's useful to have software to manage that. GlassFrog is the product from Holacracy 1. It's the absolute best tool for managing Holacracy. Does an excellent job with tactical meetings, governance meetings, and that's the tool to use if you're doing full-on Holacracy. In Teal Dog, we have some lightweight tools that just let you do the bare minimum to support a practice of action takers. So the goal again with Teal Dog is to make it as easy as possible to do this work with the minimum overhead and then the minimum required knowledge. So those are a couple tools to check out if you're interested in starting to put together some governance records. So we talked a little bit about role clarity. It tells you what is expected of you. It tells you what you can expect from others. And it lets you change expectations explicitly. I'd ask each of you right now, do you have the ability to do this in your organization? Whether you're a manager or an employee, do you know exactly what's expected of you? And do you know what you can expect of everyone else? And if you need to change that, do you have a way to do that? And again, it's important to have a single source of truth for your governance records. Okay, so 2 down. We just talked about knowing what you should do due to purpose and accountabilities. Check on that, as we say. And this also, we can also put a double check on this other one. When you have accountabilities, you really know what you can count on from others in a much, much more explicit way. Let's talk a little bit about domains and the golden rule. So here are a couple of quotes from the Holacracy Constitution. These are screenshots right out of the GitHub page. In Article 2, it says, when filling a role, you have the authority to take any action or make any decision to enact your role's purpose or accountabilities, as long as you don't break a rule defined in this Constitution. This is one of the big mindset shifts for people that are doing Holacracy. If you want to talk about action taking, you have the authority to take any action or make any decision to enact your purpose and accountabilities, as long as you don't break another rule. Now, as you saw, there are lots and lots of other rules. Most of them are fairly intuitive, and you don't very often go referencing the Constitution. But when you start with the frame where you can do anything in your power to achieve your roles and accountabilities, it's really a very different place to come from. It really turns things on its head. Now, how do we do that safely? One of the other rules is don't impact domains. So I'm just going to read the second paragraph here. You may also impact any domain held by a circle containing your role and not for the delegated, or any domain such as the circle itself may impact. This is the important part. But if you believe your impact will be substantially difficult or expensive to undo, you need advance permission. This is a way of saying you can do whatever you need to do to achieve your purpose and accountabilities, unless it's a hard to change decision. And we can get more into the nuances of that. It's useful to give examples or to have a discussion around it. But basically, once you have the golden rule, you have everyone doing whatever they want to achieve their purpose and accountabilities, and you immediately need a way to do it safely, and that's what domains are for. So we put domains on things like the bank account, or the office layout, right? Anything that would cause harm if it were changed. That's the very, very quick kind of overview. And just for completeness, I'll read this second sentence. You may not exert control or cause a material impact to a domain delegated to a role or circle that doesn't contain your role unless you get permission. Nor may you do so on a domain owned by another sovereign entity without permission. So the Constitution gets kind of wordy, but basically it's just saying don't impact domains, get permission. And generally there are ways to get permission or to find a way to do what you need to do safely. And particularly when you go to another role and you can explain what you're doing based on your accountabilities, it's a much more obvious conversation. It doesn't have to do with, your political rank or what people necessarily even think of you. It's very objective to say, I want to take this action because of what I'm up to. Uh-oh. So I'm told that we can't see the screen share anymore. Thanks for that, Trish. I'm going to take a sec here and double check. And I'm going to turn the screen share back on. And I can't see the chat right now, so I don't know if it's working. And we lost it about 11 minutes ago, so that's quite a bit of loss there. Okay, well, I'm just going to pick up and we'll keep continuing. So really briefly, we just talked about domains and the golden rule. And now that we know about that, here we go, domains and the golden rule, that you have the authority to do anything in your role's purpose or accountabilities as long as you don't break a rule. And then one of those rules is don't impact domains. This gives us tremendous flexibility as action takers. Now, I'm not proposing that you implement all of this in your organization, but it does give you a place to come from, a frame to look through. Organizations are doing this and it works. They've been doing it for years. So how can your organization start to apply some of these principles? So just to read this one more time, the golden rule of Holacracy. You have the authority to take any action or make any decision to enact your role's purpose or accountabilities as long as you don't break a rule. And we talked a little bit about what domains are. A domain is just an asset or a process or anything that a role can exclusively control. Okay, so I think we just knocked out another one. Now you know if you have the permission to do a specific thing that you're trying to do. You no longer have to seek permission. You know what you should be doing based on your purpose and accountabilities, and you know what you can count on from others based on working agreements and role definitions. And now you know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So already we're knocking out a lot of the objections that prevent people from taking action in their organizations. I want to touch on one more thing, and this is the idea of the language of action taking. In our organizations right now, people don't even know how to talk about action taking with each other. And so even if you don't adopt all of Holacracy or any of it, if you just start to use this language, it'll start to transform the way people work in your office or business or organization. And the easiest way that I do this is I just switch from making demands to making requests. So I don't say, hey, can you do this for me? Or, hey, I need this thing by then. I say, would it make sense for you in your role as developer to prioritize my bug here, blah, blah, blah. And now a person can look at it and say, yeah, that would make sense. I'll do that. And now they own it. They're owning the outcome. It's not you trying to convince them or cajole them or give them a donut if they do you a favor. They're internalizing it and doing it because they believe they should be doing it. There's a great article called How to Make Sure Someone Does Something by Chris Cohen. He's one of the partners at H1. He's brilliant. That's a good article to read if you're interested in this. And just talking a little bit about knowing how to talk about action taking, we also have the notion of projects and actions, which are related. A project is a set of actions where you're working towards an outcome. We won't get into any more detail on that right now, but David Allen's work, Getting Things Done, informs that. And now, even in the past, 20 minutes, we've covered a number of ideas here. We now have the concept of a working agreement, so I can create an agreement with you. We have the notion of aligning around purpose, of making a request, setting an expectation, the concept of governance at work, roles, domains, projects, and accountability. Just taking these things into work and having explicit meaning for them can really transform how things are going. And once you do, you'll probably start feeling some tensions. And Holacracy supports tension processing in other ways. So that puts a check on that. And we've addressed each of our items. There's a lot that we didn't address. Holacracy has a lot of concepts in it. We didn't really talk about tensions or the definition of harm, which means something specific. We have the notion of we have the notion of metrics and checklist items, which are types of updates. These things happen in tactical meetings. Our teams are called circles and have certain attributes that are different than conventional teams. And in our governance meetings, people can make objections. And when you make an objection, you need to talk about the harm, and then you move to integration. In a tactical meeting, there are many pathways for getting things done. And the collection of all of your roles is called your role constellation. And the collection of all of the roles in the organization is called the holarchy. Now, that wasn't meant to be an exhaustive explanation of any of those things. I just wanted to give you a little bit more of the territory around some of the terms that are used in Holacracy and hopefully whet your appetite a little bit for more of this in the future. So if you're still interested in all of this good stuff, there are some resources you can check out. You're welcome to check out my YouTube channel, Work Better Together. Please subscribe. I always love a good subscription. As a YouTuber, it gets me up in the morning. And if there are any topics you'd like to discuss, I would love to do some videos with you. The book also, Holacracy, is a great book, quick read. It's written in a very sort of friendly story-like format. I believe the Audible version is like 4 or 5 hours long. If you want to get to learn more about this, check out the book. Brian's a great communicator. The guys at Holacracy are amazing. So that's a good place to start. You can also check out the Holacracy Community of Practice. This is a website at community.holacracy.org where people are discussing Holacracy, and novices and experts alike are welcome there. And lastly, you can reach out to me. My email address is j@teal.dog, and you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Jonathan Yankovich. And that's it. Let's see if we can take some questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And Zach, I don't know, are you able to come back on?
Cool. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to Jonathan for presenting on that. Apologize for the short technical difficulties there, but it looks like we got the slides back up. Yeah, feel free to either, I think you should be able to turn your mics on and ask the question, or you can also post them in the chat there on the side. So we'll give it a few minutes for people to ask their questions and start answering those.
And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to do a practice that is known as a closing round. This is a practice in Holacracy. I assume you guys can see my camera. Every meeting, both the technical meeting and governance meeting, starts with a check-in round and ends with a closing round. And the purpose of a closing round is for each person to share a closing reflection. I just want to reflect, man, that was really hard. I love talking about this stuff, but man, it is so difficult to do it into a vacuum like this. But I really appreciate everyone sticking with me. I'm sorry about the technical problems. I feel like I rushed. But you know, we're only human. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm not seeing any yet.
I see one here from Libby. She's looking for a link to the community of practice and how they work.
There we go. Sure. So it's community.holacracy.org. And a question I have for you guys, do you see any of these concepts that might be useful to apply in your organization? Maybe you can throw out one or two of the ideas I talked about into the chat. Perhaps what's the most useful thing that you learned? Nancy asks a great question. Does this model ever feel pedantic, or as if you spend too much time creating the culture instead of working? Yes. This is a common complaint of people that are new to Holacracy. Now, what I'm talking about is taking some of the pieces and using them in your current power structure. But when you actually move to full-on Holacracy with governance and tactical meetings, it adds a layer of overhead. But what disappears is all of the management that's happening now. All of the convincing and cajoling and trying to decide things. It really transforms people's experience of work, and you get better at it. An analogy I like to make is sort of the difference between a kingdom and a republic. You know, thousands of years ago, we had kingdoms that were run by emperors, and the emperor did whatever he wanted. And if you were the emperor's buddy, then you got more gold. And when you move to a system of law, people change. Because I live in America, I'm subject to certain laws. I have to follow certain rules. And by doing that, I know what's allowed and what's not, and I'm free. In other places where there's no rule of law, people aren't free. And most of us are in our organizations living in that environment without really even maybe being aware of it. So yes, does it feel like you're spending too much time creating the culture instead of working? And I want to correct you say on creating the culture. Does it feel like you're spending too much time working on the business instead of working in the business is how I might put that. And that's a fairly common concern. So we got about 12 minutes left, I think. Great question, Nancy. Thank you. Trish asked a question. Question for you. What was an element that you loved the most, that you were excited to go work and use? For me, the whole thing, when taken together, the way it changes your perspective, it changes your approach to others and to yourself. And I know that's like a kind of a woo-woo thing to say, but really most of the people that I know who have practiced Holacracy, it changes them. It changes how they relate to power. And and how they approach the world. You know, no longer are you in an environment where you're being treated like a child. You're being treated like an adult, and you have to reason about things like an adult, and you have to check the Constitution just like you do your taxes. And terrible analogy, but for me, it's really transformative in that way. Concretely, roles are great. Making requests of someone in a role so they know what's expected of them. Sometimes you might have two competing roles or two separate roles, and you might have a different answer for someone depending on which role you're in. What's a concrete example? Let's take marketing versus engineering. And if anybody else has a question, feel free to drop it in. I'm just kind of riffing here. Marketing and engineering. So suppose somebody has a question about, can we have a certain feature that does a certain thing? Well, marketing wants more sales. They want to generate income. They have certain accountabilities around that. They have a purpose around that. And they'll probably say, oh yeah, we should totally do that thing you're suggesting. Engineering has different accountabilities around maintaining uptime and system integrity and safety. And they might say, well, no, it's really not a good idea to do that. The same person filling those two roles might answer that exact same question differently depending on which role is being asked. And that's really interesting to me. And Trish, going back to your question, an element that I love the most, one of my colleagues at Holacracy One, he talks a lot about how the concepts in Holacracy and the personal accountability has really informed his personal relationship with his sweetie more than it's really changed anything in his work life. When you have these concepts around how to take action and you can talk explicitly about them, you can really start to tease apart and diffuse a lot of the invisible, implicit reasons that we suffer. Now, one thing, I had a slide that I took out of the deck that talked about the realization that there's something wrong or the admission that there's a problem. I'll try to make that analogy now. When a person goes to therapy, they don't go there because everything's great, usually. You sit down and you talk about your problems and you get really clear on them, and it hurts often. When you start doing Holacracy, you get clear that things hurt. What's my point there? The first thing that we need in order to have an environment of action takers, a culture of action takers, is the ability to admit to ourselves that things could be better, that things aren't great. I like to call this enlightened dissent. The idea that it's okay to disagree, it's okay to be pissed off, it's okay to dissent in the organization, and it's actually encouraged and it's healthy if it's done in an enlightened way. That's very different than how a lot of people are just like kind of grumpy and pissed off at work, because when you have a tension in Holacracy, you also have a duty to process it. So if you're pissed off, it's your duty to get that tension resolved. And sometimes that means really looking at the tension and saying, is this my personal tension or is this an organizational tension? Or does my role care or does somebody else's role care? If their role cares, okay, now I've got a new problem. I've got to pitch them, and a pitch is a concept we use also. We've got to pitch them on why this is important, why this is important. If they don't agree, well, now I've got a new tension. Do I want to get them out of their role? Now I got to pitch somebody else on taking them out of their role and getting myself into the role so I can do the work. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance, as I said in the beginning, and there's a lot of pathways to get things done. Yeah. Let's see if we can get one more question. What I'd really like to hear is another word or two just about which of these concepts people found useful. So something I'm hoping to do in the coming weeks with the Teal Dog project is to build in a lot of automatic help systems. As Nancy was talking about, doesn't the system feel pedantic as if people are spending too much time on the culture instead of working? Trish says, I think having a commonality of language is very helpful and a concrete approach. Yeah, Trish, I agree. One of my biggest frustrations is when people cheerlead about culture or change, or especially in the Bay Area and in the startup community. We've got, you talk to somebody at a startup and they say, oh, it's great. We've got really flexible. It's really flexible. You can work at home and we've got unlimited vacation. And well, what does that really mean? Can I really test the boundaries of that? In Holacracy, you can test the boundaries. You know the rules. They're written down. But what that really means is, we expect you to work all the time, and we really don't do vacations around here because everyone wants to prove how awesome they are. So that's the shift between explicit and implicit. And if this whole thing leaves you a little rubs you the wrong way, leaves you a little cheesed off, I think that's good. It's actually healthy. And I think that we are too accustomed to just being nice and going along to get along. We can work together and disagree. We can love each other and disagree. And having those conversations is how we get to new understandings. That's really one of the key things I wanted to say here. So we've got about 4 minutes left. If there are no more questions, I'm going to do a quick, what will be most useful to everyone? Is Holacracy, okay, so Libby asks, is Holacracy usually started top down or can it be grassroots? Great question. So to be successful, it really requires that the main power holder be invested in the outcome. And if you're doing proper Holacracy by the book, as Holacracy 1 prescribes, the first order of business is for the power holder to declare that the Constitution is now the rule of law. We actually call it signing the Constitution. We have a little ceremony. And it's a figurative act. It's not a legally binding act. But when the boss says, I cede my power to this process, you can now depend on this process, and I agree, this is a working agreement, I agree to be bound by the rules of this process. That is fundamental. And that's where the real power shift comes from. Now, that's not always possible. In cases where it's not, you can have a department head say, okay, guys, we're going to operate as a Holacracy. Here's the rules, go. And that works fairly well to get started. It's a great way to get started in a smaller organization, or rather in a larger organization if you have just a team. Libby, if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to talk to you about what it takes. There are ways to bootstrap it so you can do it yourself. You can also hire coaches to help. And once you're starting to do some of these things inside the organization, you can then see, is it working and will it spread? You can also take the pieces that do work and eventually stop. Not every organization that starts with Holacracy keeps with it. And I'm not saying it's the best thing for everyone. I just know that it's been personally transformational, and I can't imagine going back. And just something to leave you guys excited here. You're welcome, Libby. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of GlassFrog. This is Holacracy 1's product for managing Holacracy. Up here in the right-hand corner, you can see the hierarchy for Holacracy 1. And all of these governance records are public. I'll paste a link to the chat. Jamie, please reach out to me. I'll drop my email in the chat, and we can talk about if Holacracy is right for your organization. There's my email. We have about 1 minute left. What I'm sharing here is the Holarchy for Holacracy 1. And we can click into any of these pieces and we can see the whole organization. Sometimes visualizing it helps a lot. So each of these areas is called a circle or a team, and each one is made up of roles. And you can have roles within roles, circles within circles. And let's see, where's developer? Developer, here's the developer. So this is the role that I was originally hired for at Holacracy 1. And it looks like I can't load it from here. Okay, so I think we're at time. I'm gonna see if Zach wants to jump back on here.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thanks again, Jonathan, and thanks to everyone for sticking around. Want to be respectful of everyone's time. So yeah, feel free to follow up with Jonathan directly if you'd like to learn more. And this webinar was recorded as well, so we'll be sending out how you can access that replay if you want to rewatch anything or grab Jonathan's contact info. Feel free to give us a shout. Thanks again for joining us. And yeah, Jonathan, anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Yeah, please reach out, j@teal.dog. You can also visit teal.dog on the internet, YouTube, Work Better Together. And yeah, let's just keep working better together.
Awesome. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.